that the Antonov An-225 Mriya cargo plane was destroyed in a Russian assault on an airfield near Kiev, Ukraine. Grim footage shows the legendary plane's wreckage. The Antonov An-225 Mriya was designed to carry spacecraft for the former USSR.
In aviation history, few machines have ever looked as though they belonged to another world. The Antonov An-225 Mriya was one of them, a six-engine giant with an 88.4-meter wingspan.
The Antonov An-225 is unique. It's set over 200 world records and has a huge global following.
So instead of 4, there are 6. That means their total thrust on takeoff is over 100 tons. Can you imagine? That's the capacity of these 6 engines.
And a maximum takeoff weight of 640 tons. Born during the Cold War to support the Soviet Buran space program, it survived the collapse of the Soviet Union and eventually found a new life as a commercial heavy-lift aircraft. For decades, it carried extraordinary cargo across the world and became an international aviation icon. Then, in February 2022, the Mriya was destroyed at Hostomel Airport. But could its unfinished second airframe bring the legendary dream back to the sky? The birth of the Mriya. The story of the An-225 began with a problem created by the Soviet space program. During the final years of the Cold War, the Soviet Union was developing the Buran reusable spacecraft and the Energia launch system. These programs required enormous aerospace components to be transported between factories, testing facilities, and launch areas. The Soviet Union already possessed the Antonov An-24 Ruslan, an aircraft that was itself among the largest transport aircraft of its generation. But even the An-124 could not fully satisfy the requirements of the Buran program. The spacecraft and associated equipment were simply too large and too heavy for conventional air transport. Antonov engineers therefore had to go beyond an existing design and create a completely new aircraft. According to Antonov's official history, the An-225 was specifically developed to transport the Buran shuttle orbiter.
The Antonov An-225, one of its most important potential loads was the Soviet space shuttle, the Buran. It could be used to carry the Buran piggyback fashion
And components of the Energia carrier rocket. The resulting aircraft was enormous, even by the standards of late 20th century aviation. The An-225 measured 84 meters from nose to tail and stood 18.2 meters high. Its wings stretched 88.4 meters across, giving it a wing area of approximately 905 square meters. It was powered by 6 engines and designed to carry extra heavy and oversized cargo either inside its huge fuselage or externally above the aircraft. Its maximum takeoff weight reached 640 tons. These numbers were not created simply to break records. Every part of the aircraft's size was connected to a practical requirement. The designers needed an airframe strong enough to carry massive loads, wings large enough to generate sufficient lift, and engines powerful enough to move the aircraft and its cargo into the sky. The aircraft's unusual appearance also came directly from its mission. One of its most recognizable features was the twin-tail arrangement at the rear. Instead of using a single vertical stabilizer, the Mriya used 2 vertical fins. This was especially useful because the aircraft was designed to carry enormous objects externally on top of the fuselage. When a spacecraft such as Buran was mounted above the aircraft, it would affect the airflow around the rear of the fuselage. The twin-tail configuration helped the aircraft maintain the aerodynamic control needed for such an unusual cargo arrangement. The Mriya therefore looked different because it had been designed around a problem that ordinary transport aircraft had never been expected to solve. Building the aircraft required an industrial effort almost as extraordinary as the aircraft itself. Antonov's records show that the fuselage and tail unit were assembled at the Antonov facility in Kiev, while the wing center section and outer wing panels were assembled in Tashkent. These enormous wing structures then had to be transported from Tashkent to Kiev using another giant of Soviet aviation, the Antonov An-22. In other words, even the construction of the Mriya depended on one of the Soviet Union's other heavy transport aircraft. The scale of the project extended far beyond a single factory or a single assembly line. The first aircraft was rolled out of the Antonov assembly shop in November 1988. Just weeks later, on December 21st, the An-225 made its first flight from the factory airfield at Sviatoshin. The aircraft was flown by a crew led by test pilot Alexander Galunenko. At that moment, Antonov had created something that had no real equivalent in operational aviation. The Mriya was not simply another large cargo plane. It was a specialized flying machine built around the enormous requirements of a space program. The aircraft quickly demonstrated that its extraordinary dimensions translated into extraordinary performance. On March 22, 1989, the Mriya carried a payload of 156.3 tons and established 110 world records.
The Antonov 225, the largest aircraft ever built. This supersized Ukrainian jet is limbering up for a world record-shattering airlift,
involving speed, altitude, and weight-to-altitude performance during a single flight. The event demonstrated that the aircraft's huge size was not simply a visual spectacle. It had been engineered to lift weights that were previously beyond the reach of conventional air transport. But the most famous demonstration of the Mriya's original purpose came soon afterward. In May 1989, the aircraft carried the Buran shuttle orbiter on top of its fuselage from Baikonur. The shuttle weighed around 60 tons. The combination of the enormous six-engine aircraft and the spacecraft sitting above it created one of the most unforgettable images of Soviet aerospace engineering. Antonov records that 13 test flights were conducted with the Mriya and Buran combination around Baikonur. The aircraft had become a flying part of the Soviet space program itself. Yet the political world surrounding the aircraft was changing rapidly. The Buran program never became the operational reusable spacecraft system that Soviet planners had envisioned, and the Soviet Union itself collapsed in 1991. With the disappearance of the political and economic system that had created the aircraft, the original reason for its existence also disappeared. The Mriya had been designed for a future that suddenly no longer existed. The aircraft entered a period of inactivity. For a machine that had represented one of the greatest industrial ambitions of the Soviet Union, the situation was almost tragic. The world's largest aircraft had become a machine without a mission.
And this is the biggest aircraft in the world. This was the biggest aircraft in the world. It was called Mriya. It means dream in English. And you see what Russian world made with our dream.
But the Mriya still possessed one capability that the changing world could not easily replace: enormous lifting capacity. The collapse of the Soviet space program did not eliminate the need to move huge objects. Modern industries continued producing massive generators, transformers, construction machines, and other equipment that could weigh well over 100 tons. Transporting these objects by road or rail could involve complicated routes, special permits, bridge assessments, and weeks of planning. Sea transport could handle the weight, but often required far more time and additional movement between ports and final destinations. Mriya offered something different. It could simply fly the cargo. After years on the ground, the aircraft was reconditioned and eventually returned to flight. Antonov records May 7, 2001, as the date of its first flight following the overhaul after approximately 7 years of downtime. Later that month, the aircraft received its type certificate. The Mriya had entered a completely new stage of its life. The aircraft that had once been created for a Soviet spacecraft was now preparing to serve the global industrial economy, and that second life would make it famous in a way its original designers could never have fully predicted. The dream becomes a global legend. The Mriya's commercial career was built around one simple advantage. There were cargoes that other aircraft simply could not carry. The aircraft was not intended to compete with ordinary cargo jets transporting standardized freight. Its value came from exceptional missions involving enormous objects that created transportation problems of their own. The aircraft's record shows just how unusual those missions became. In 2004, the Mriya carried 247 tons of cargo from Prague to Tashkent, including 4 pipe-laying machines, and established 6 world records. 6 years later, it transported 2 wind turbine blades measuring 42.1 meters each from China to Denmark for testing. Then, in 2016, the aircraft carried a 155-ton electric turbine inside a special 27-ton frame from Sao Paulo to Santiago, with the total cargo weight reaching 182 tons. These missions demonstrated why the Mriya remained valuable, despite its enormous operating costs. A company would not choose the aircraft simply because it was cheaper than every other method of transportation. Instead, it could choose the Mriya because no practical alternative could deliver the same cargo as quickly. A massive generator needed at a power plant, for example, could become a critical part of an industrial project. Delays could cost far more than the price of an extraordinary airlift. The Mriya therefore operated in a very unusual part of the aviation market. It was not designed for volume. It was designed for impossibility. And the more extraordinary its missions became, the more famous the aircraft itself became. People began traveling to airports simply to see it. Aviation enthusiasts tracked its movements. Photographs of the aircraft carrying giant industrial machines spread around the world. The Mriya's size made it instantly recognizable, even to people who knew very little about aircraft. Its 6 engines, enormous wings, and distinctive twin-tail structure gave it a silhouette that could not easily be confused with anything else. The name made the legend even stronger. Mriya means dream in Ukrainian. The aircraft had been born in the Soviet Union, but it continued its operational life from Ukraine after the Soviet collapse. Over time, the Mriya became increasingly associated with Ukrainian aerospace engineering and became one of the country's most recognizable technological symbols. Its operational career also showed an extraordinary ability to adapt. The aircraft was no longer carrying a space shuttle. It was carrying industrial machinery, energy equipment, and oversized cargo. In 2020, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the Mriya was used to transport medical supplies. Antonov reported that on April 23, 2020, the aircraft delivered more than 103 tons of medical equipment from Tianjin, China, to Ukraine, with the cargo occupying roughly 1,000 cubic meters. The image was almost symbolic. A machine created during the Cold War for one of the world's most ambitious space programs was now being used during a global health crisis. The technology had survived long enough to serve a completely different generation. But behind Mriya's success was a fact that made its existence unusually fragile. There was only one completed aircraft. Antonov's official history confirms that 2 An-225 airframes were built, but only one was completed. The second aircraft remained unfinished. For decades, that incomplete airframe sat in the background of the Mriya story. It was part of the aircraft's history, but there was no immediate reason to spend enormous amounts of money completing it. The existing Mriya was already operating, and the market for aircraft of this scale was extremely specialized. So the world had one operational Mriya, and then, in February 2022, that one aircraft was destroyed. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine began on February 24, 2022, and Hostomel Airport near Kyiv became one of the important battlefields during the opening stages of the war.
On February 24th. This is Antonov military airport, and the Russian army parachuted into this military airport and took it from the Ukrainians.
Mriya was at the airport. It was not in a position to simply escape the fighting, and the aircraft was ultimately destroyed. Reuters reported that the Ukrainian-made An-225 was burned during the fighting at Hostomel Airport. Images released afterwards showed the remains of the enormous aircraft inside the damaged airport complex. For aviation, the loss was extraordinary. The aircraft had survived the end of the Soviet Union, years of inactivity, and decades of heavy-lift operations around the world. It had carried a space shuttle, industrial machines, and humanitarian cargo. It had established world records and become an aviation celebrity. Now, it was a wreck. And because only one Mriya had been completed, there was no identical aircraft ready to replace it, but there was something else. The second unfinished airframe. For decades, that second structure had represented an incomplete chapter of Soviet aviation history. After Hostomel, it suddenly represented something much more important. A possible future. The second Mriya. Can the dream rise again? The idea of rebuilding the Mriya sounds simple when reduced to a headline. The original aircraft is destroyed. The second airframe exists. And therefore the second aircraft could theoretically be completed. But an aircraft is much more than its fuselage and wings. A completed An-225 would require engines, landing gear, hydraulic systems, electrical systems, fuel systems, flight controls, avionics, navigation equipment, communication systems, and many other components. Every system would need to work together safely. The airframe itself would have to be inspected and assessed. Engineers would have to determine exactly which existing structures and components could be reused and which would have to be manufactured again. The age of the unfinished airframe makes the challenge even greater. The aircraft was designed during the 1980s. Some suppliers and manufacturing facilities that produced its original components may no longer exist. Some components may no longer be manufactured in their original form. At the same time, modern aviation has advanced significantly in avionics, navigation, communications, and other systems. A future Mriya could therefore look almost identical from the outside, while being substantially different internally. The destroyed aircraft might also provide some usable components. In November 2022, Antonov confirmed that reconstruction work had begun and said that expert estimates indicated approximately 30% of the components that could be used for the second aircraft were already available. The company estimated the construction cost at least 500 million euros, while emphasizing that it was too early to provide an exact final figure. This clarification is extremely important. Some initial reports suggested that the new aircraft was already 30% complete. Antonov later clarified that the 30% figure referred to components that were available and could be used in the second aircraft. It did not mean that 30% of the finished flying aircraft had already been built. That difference completely changes how the project should be understood. Having 30% of usable components does not mean that the remaining 70% is simply waiting to be assembled. Aircraft construction also involves engineering, manufacturing, system integration, inspections, ground testing, flight testing, and certification. The 500 million euro estimate also needs to be understood carefully. It was a preliminary minimum estimate, not a final confirmed project budget. Antonov itself said it was too early to determine the exact amount. And the technical challenge does not end when the aircraft is physically assembled. Before another Mriya could begin commercial operations, engineers would have to test its systems thoroughly. Engines would need to be started and tested. Hydraulic and electrical systems would need to be checked. The aircraft would need ground testing and taxi trials. Then would come flight testing, where engineers would examine how the aircraft performs in the air and whether all systems behave as expected. A first flight would therefore be only one milestone in a much longer process. There is also the question of certification and commercial operation. A giant aircraft carrying hundreds of tons of cargo cannot simply leave the runway after construction and immediately begin international commercial missions. It must meet the necessary safety and operational requirements. Then comes the biggest question of all. Is there enough demand for another Mriya? The answer is complicated. There is clearly a market for extraordinary heavy-lift transportation. Antonov's own history proves that the Mriya was able to carry cargoes that were beyond the capabilities of most aircraft. But these missions are relatively rare. Most cargo in the world does not require a 6-engine aircraft with a 250-ton payload capability. A future Mriya would therefore remain a specialist aircraft. Its customers would likely be companies and organizations with cargo that is exceptionally heavy, exceptionally large, or exceptionally urgent. For such customers, the cost of air transport may be justified because alternative methods could be slower or technically difficult. That was the original commercial logic behind the aircraft, and it remains relevant. But there is another reason the aircraft matters. The Mriya has become a symbol. Its destruction was not simply the loss of an aircraft. It was the destruction of a unique piece of Ukrainian aerospace history. Rebuilding it could therefore have significance beyond commercial aviation. The aircraft could become a symbol of engineering continuity and resilience. Ukrainian officials have publicly discussed rebuilding the aircraft, and reports have described the project as having both engineering and symbolic importance. But symbolism cannot eliminate the realities of engineering and finance. A project costing at least 500 million euros would require enormous resources. The aircraft would need a supply chain capable of producing specialized components. Engineers would need access to technical documentation and manufacturing knowledge. Testing facilities would have to be available. The project would need long-term financial support. And perhaps most importantly, the world would need patience. Because building another Mriya is not like restoring an old car. it is closer to recreating an entire aviation ecosystem. The first aircraft benefited from an enormous industrial network that existed during the Soviet period. A modern reconstruction would have to reproduce many of those capabilities under completely different political, economic, and technological conditions. That is why the second Mriya should not be described as a finished aircraft simply waiting for engines. It is better described as a foundation made possible by the existence of the unfinished second airframe, the engineering knowledge preserved by Antonov, and potentially usable components from the destroyed aircraft. And that foundation creates a possibility that would otherwise be impossible. Imagine the project eventually reaches completion. The engines are installed, the aircraft systems are tested. Engineers inspect every major component. The landing gear supports the aircraft's enormous weight. The cockpit systems come alive. And then, after years of work, the 6 engines begin to turn. One after another, they roar into life. The aircraft begins moving down the runway. The wings stretch across the sky. The Mriya accelerates. And finally, the wheels leave the ground. If that moment ever happens, it would represent more than the return of a giant cargo aircraft. The first Mriya was a product of the Cold War. The second could become a product of recovery. The first aircraft carried Buran. The second could carry modern industrial cargo. The first represented Soviet aerospace ambition. The second could represent Ukrainian engineering resilience. And both would share the same basic identity: Mriya, the dream. Yet it is important to keep the story grounded in reality. There is no confirmed guarantee that the second aircraft will eventually fly. The reconstruction concept announced by Antonov faces enormous financial, technical, and logistical challenges. The €500 million figure was a preliminary minimum estimate, and the company's clarification showed that the project was in the design and component availability stage rather than being a nearly completed aircraft. That uncertainty actually makes the story more fascinating, because the second Mriya is not a guaranteed resurrection. It is a possibility. And sometimes the most powerful stories in aviation come from machines that exist between history and the future. The original Mriya was created because existing aircraft were not enough. It became the largest and most capable aircraft of its kind. It carried the Buran spacecraft across the Soviet Union. It established records. It disappeared from service. It returned. It became a commercial heavy-lift legend. It carried massive industrial equipment across continents. It became one of the world's most recognizable aircraft. Then war destroyed it at Hostomel. But the destruction did not erase every trace of the aircraft. The unfinished second airframe remained. And that is the reason the Mriya story still has an unfinished chapter. The second aircraft may never fly. The project may prove too expensive. The engineering challenges may become too great. The commercial case may not be strong enough. But if the project succeeds, the aircraft will carry something much heavier than cargo. It will carry history. Every flight would remind the world that the original Mriya existed. Every engine would represent decades of engineering knowledge. Every landing would connect a modern aircraft to a machine that was born during the Cold War and survived long after the Cold War ended. And perhaps that is the most fitting ending for an aircraft whose name means dream. The first Mriya proved that an aircraft could be built on an almost unimaginable scale. A second Mriya, if it ever takes to the sky, would prove that the destruction of the original did not necessarily mean the end of the idea behind it. For now, the unfinished airframe remains a possibility, not a guarantee, not a completed aircraft, not a machine that can simply be rolled onto a runway tomorrow, but a foundation for one of the most ambitious aircraft reconstruction projects aviation has ever seen. And until that possibility disappears completely, the story of the An-225 Mriya is not finished. The Antonov An-225 Mriya was more than an aircraft. It became a symbol of engineering, ambition, and resilience. Although the original giant was destroyed at Hostomel, an unfinished airframe still leaves open the possibility of another Mriya taking to the skies. Whether that dream becomes reality remains uncertain, but the story of the world's most extraordinary cargo aircraft is far from forgotten. If you enjoyed this documentary, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more incredible aviation stories.